Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and today we're going to take a look at this thing right here, which is the Lenovo ThinkCentre M90q Tiny. Now this is Lenovo's flagship 1-liter corporate desktop PC right now, but you may have heard the Lenovo M90 a few times already. At STH, we're doing Project Tiny Mini Micro. We're taking a look at over 3 dozen of these about 1-liter corporate desktop PCs. And as you would imagine with anything, as you kind of get into the 3rd dozen and get into the 4th, you start looking at a couple ancillary things. So for example, we've taken a look at 2 recent 11th gen Intel NUCs. And then the other big one is that we've done some of these smaller Lenovo nodes. Specifically, we've done the Lenovo M90N. So while this is the M90q Tiny, there's also the M90N Nano. And we've already done 2 M90N Nano. Specifically, we did the M90N Nano IoT, which is this one on top. And then on the bottom, we did the normal M90N Nano. But this is the M90q Tiny. This is actually the first Project Tiny Mini Micro node that we're going to be looking at as part of our new series. Now, what I actually did was I said, hey, it's kind of cool that we've been going and looking at some of the used units. Now we have an entire playlist of Project Tiny Mini Micro videos. We also have a bunch of reviews on the STH main site. We have guides in terms of how to turn it into things like Plex servers, pfSense appliances, all kinds of things. But I think that the interesting bit about what we're doing now and this new phase of Project Tiny Mini Micro is that we're looking at really the current generation nodes. Specifically, this is the current generation Lenovo node until the 11th gen comes out, which hopefully it hasn't by the time this video comes out. And we've already looked at the M75q Gen 2, which is on this side, and we also are going to look at the M80q, which is tiny, which is right here as well. Additionally, we have the HP EliteDesk 800G6 35 and 65 watt units. We also have the Dell Optiplex 7080 Micro, and so we have the Lenovo HP and Dell units for this generation as well. And with all these Project Tiny Mini Micro series videos, we have a pretty kind of basic structure. First, we're going to look at the hardware, then we're going to talk about performance, power consumption, and then finally, we are going to get into a key lesson learned. And the key lesson learned is actually kind of fun on this one because this is one of the first units that I actually ordered and configured. So I got a configure to order unit instead of just buying one off of eBay used or just buying one off the website as it was already configured. This is actually one that I configured myself, and I want to show you what I did. And the reason I want to show you what I did was I want to talk about pricing, number one, but I also want to show you about some of the mistakes that I think I made in the process. So let's get to it. All right, so on the front of the unit, you're going to notice that we have a fairly standard Lenovo layout in terms of ports. We have a headset jack, so we have a legacy headset jack. You do have something you can wire into. You don't need to use Bluetooth on this particular device. You also have 2 USB ports. One is a USB 3.2 Gen 2 port, which is the Type A port, but the USB-C port is a Gen 1 port, which means that's a 5 gigabit per second port, while the Gen 2 port is a 10 gigabit per second port. If you're confused by USB naming conventions, you're not the only one. They're absolutely terrible at naming things. All right, so on the rear of the unit, we have some fairly standard Lenovo I/O, but we should probably go through it. So first off, we have a display port. We also have HDMI ports. So you have both standard on this form factor, which means that if you have to go hook it up to a TV, super easy HDMI cable. If you want to do a second display, you can use the DisplayPort output as well. There are also 4 USB Type A ports on the back of this unit, and 2 of them are Gen 1 ports, 2 of them are Gen 2 ports. But you're going to notice that this particular unit has a USB Type-C port. And the reason I got this is because, well, I only use it as USB Type-C, but you could also potentially use an adapter and get DisplayPort out of this as well. So instead of getting a third DisplayPort output, I figured, well, why would I not just get the USB Type-C and then have the ability to have a USB Type-C port, because that's always useful. And then if you do want to have a third display, then you do have the option to do that. At the same time, usually I only use these with a maximum of 1 display, so frankly, this is going to be a USB-C port for me. Networking on this unit is provided by the Intel i219LM. That's required because this unit does support vPro. You're also going to see the wireless antenna that we're going to get to when we get inside. But before we get inside the chassis, I want to talk about the configuration option that you may have seen depending on the B-roll that we're showing and photos that we're showing. But you may have seen that on the front of the system, there's actually this little extra bit out here. And what that actually is that is the dust shield option. So I didn't know what it was, and it was like, I don't know, it was like 15 bucks, 20 bucks, whatever it was to go and upgrade to a dust shield. So I said, yeah, of course I need a dust shield. And basically what it is you get this little tiny strip that just goes onto the front of the chassis, and it has a little tiny mesh in it. And apparently that mesh, it collects the dust so the dust doesn't get inside your system. So I guess if you want to go wash out your dust filter, you just pop the thing off and then wash it out and then plop it back on. But this is not the only filter and air inlet on the system, so I don't actually think it's as effective as I was kind of hoping. The other air input is really on the top of this chassis. And so you can see on the top of this chassis here that there's a giant air vent, and that's used to pull air in to be able to cool the CPU. This is a very high-end 10-core CPU that we're gonna get to in a little bit. Also, something in Lenovo's newest generation that we haven't covered yet, but I think it is important because this was on the M95q Gen 2, probably should have covered there. It's also on the M80q. So I think that, it's just one of these things that Lenovo is doing now is that there's actually vents on the side of this chassis. So older generations and some from other vendors have solid sides, which basically means that all of your airflow goes directly through the front of the chassis and out through the rear. This has venting on the side of the chassis, which is just a little bit different, and it does matter if you're going to go tightly pack these things. You may want to go and find one that is pure front to rear airflow. This has vents on the side, it has a vent on the top, it has a vent on the bottom. I mean, there's vents literally on almost every, if not every single panel on this thing. And so that's a little different when you start to plan your airflow versus some of the other units out there. Okay, so getting inside the chassis is still super easy like it is with other Lenovo units. However, I have to say, this was the one point that I was by far the most disappointed in the system. On this, I ordered, and you can see this here, that I actually ordered the toolless option because I figured, I don't really, we do so many of these and it just saves me a couple extra seconds every time to not have to go pull out the screwdriver. And yet I still got a little Phillips head screw. In comparison, because we've already done the testing and shot the B-roll already, I know that the new generation Dells and HPs also they both have this like captive screw. So the screw stays in the chassis and it doesn't come out like the Lenovo one does, and it's a thumb screw, so it's super easy. And frankly, Lenovo, just thumb screw, not this screw. Especially when it's ordered as an option and you don't deliver it. All right, so getting inside the chassis, we just pop off the top cover and we're inside. Now, this actually surprised me what we got with this system because I didn't order a lot of the extra frills like the keyboard and mouse and stuff like that. I took the couple dollar discount. I would normally say to go get those things, but on the other hand, just for me, I have now so many Lenovo keyboards that I surely do not need any more ever in my lifetime. And I really did other than the CPU, I really did a pretty minimal config on this particular system. So I was a little bit surprised because when I opened it up, what I saw was that I actually got the SATA cage with the SATA hard drive power or SSD power and data cable included. This system supports a 2.5-inch SATA drive. You can either use a hard drive or a SSD. These days, I would probably tell you just to use an SSD because I think it makes sense in these chassis. And in this generation, it's all toolless, so you can get to the drive, install the drive and everything. It just pops right in place. Super easy in this. And I was surprised that it came with this unit because sometimes when you don't order a 2.5-inch drive, you don't get the cage. But in this particular unit, I did, and I have no idea why. You can remove the fan shroud and get to the heatsink, especially if you need to go clean it. That's super easy. You don't need any tools. You just pop the plastic cover off. That's not a big deal. And the heatsink is actually, this is a 35-watt unit, so it actually is not the most robust heatsink that we're going to see in the newer generation of systems, but that's just kind of how you get under there. It's super fast. The big one though is definitely what is behind and underneath that 2.5-inch carrier. So first off, I mentioned that we talked about wireless. I did configure this with wireless. I always configure these units with wireless if I'm going to configure them myself. And the reason for that is it's just easier to have them all pre-wired for wireless than to have to go and retrofit it. I've retrofit a couple of these systems and it can be done. It's not really that hard, but I just kind of find it more convenient and it's usually not that much more to just go get it from the factory. So if you are configuring these, that would definitely be a tip. In this particular unit, we have Intel AX201 Wi-Fi, and that allows us to have vPro over both the Intel i219LM Ethernet as well as the Wi-Fi connection as well. The Intel AX201 is a Wi-Fi 6th generation NIC, and we also get Bluetooth 5 with that. There are a couple other little features that I want to point out. First, there's an M.2 component like pad placement that's not populated in this one, but it says it's for WWAN. So I don't think that this particular unit has the capability to go and put an M.2 card in if you want to go do that kind of like LTE card or something like that. But it maybe is possible in other units. It's just we don't have the components placed on this one. So aside from WWAN not being placed, there are some things here that are placed that are actually really exciting. The first one is we have Lenovo's little riser slot. Now in this system, you could actually get a whole bunch of different configuration options. You can get things like at the quad port Intel i350 NIC, which I think a lot of people really are excited by. There's a little riser that comes out of the PCB, goes into the slot on the bottom of this motherboard, and then you can go and have a normal PCIe card. There are a couple of other options, but personally I just have the USB Type-C port here, and I looked at getting this, but it was going to delay the shipment, which frankly I should have done because it's taken so long to get this review out. But on the other hand, it did add like many weeks to the configuration, so I just didn't get it done. They are very hard to find and very expensive to get the riser and NIC afterwards. So I would suggest that if this is something that you want, you do have the riser slot in this M90q, but then also I would actually get this configured with that option if that's something I really wanted, because I think that it's just nicer and it's cleaner when Lenovo does it. There is a TBT HDR label on the motherboard, and there is a little header, and I think that this is actually a Thunderbolt header, but I didn't actually get the Thunderbolt option. I didn't see the Thunderbolt option on the configurator, but that is at least the most interesting label that I saw here. Now you might be wondering what in the heck this giant black plate is, and that's actually underneath there is where the Intel Q470 chipset is, and that I guess is helping to aid in cooling. There's some big thermal pads that go between the chipset and this cover. So at this point, if you watch a bunch of the Project Tiny Mini Micro videos, you know what's coming since this is a Lenovo system. If you haven't, you might be wondering where the memory and the M.2 SSD or SSDs are. And to do that on Lenovo systems, modern ones, you just plop open the bottom panel and you're inside. So on the top here, what you're going to see is that we have two SODIMM slots. Now, given our configuration of processor, we have dual channel memory, and we also can use up to DDR4 2933 memory in this generation. The 11th gen is when we get DDR4 3200 support, but this is still a 10th gen part. The other really cool thing that I'm super excited about on the system is the fact that we not only get Lenovo's M.2 toolless blue tab option, but we also get dual M.2 slots here. Something that I noticed that was a little bit weird in our system was that there's this like little plastic bit that was sitting on one of the pads, and I don't think it was supposed to be there, but that was just how it came. And so I thought that was a little bit funny. I took a photo of it so you can see it here. Maybe Lenovo's quality is slacking a little bit. Also, just pointing out real quick, where the thermal pads are for the bottom side of the SSDs, those actually go to basically where that black plate was on the other side of the system. So this is where the black plate is here, and if you go over here, that's where the SSDs are. So it's actually on just the opposite side, and so I don't know if that's the reason that there is a black plate there, maybe for a little extra cooling. That would be my guess, but I have no idea. Also, the bottom cover has holes, so we actually get a little bit of cooling on the SSDs as well. Now, in terms of CPU, we have something that is completely special. This is an Intel Core i9-10900T, which is a 10-core 35-watt TDP CPU. In this generation, we still have the Intel UHD 630 graphics, so it isn't necessarily the new graphics that we get with the 11th gen Tiger Lake parts. But to me, at least, the big feature is really the Core i9 10-core CPU, because I think that's absolutely awesome. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, why do I have 4 gigabytes of memory in here and a 128 gig DRAM-less SSD? And the real reason for that is 100% simple, and that's really just that the cost to go and upgrade those on the Lenovo configurator were too high compared to the fact that we have all the stuff sitting in the lab to go and outfit this with a lot more. So instead of using something like 4 gigs in this configuration, we actually have 64 gigabytes of memory that we use to test in this particular system. And we also upgraded the SSD to a 1 terabyte model. But in terms of performance, the Intel Core i9-10900T is really interesting. The base clock on it is only 1.9 gigahertz. But the turbo boost is 4.6 gigahertz. So the interesting thing about the CPU is the fact that, yeah, it is totally thermally constrained at that 35 watt TDP. In fact, you can actually configure it to a lower TDP as well, but that is kind of pointless in a system like this where you already have a high core count CPU that's being constrained by thermals anyway. I don't think that's really worth it. The 35 watts, frankly, seems a little bit low now that I've used it. The real answer in terms of performance is that if you can actually scale and it's not going to use too much power in terms of what you're scaling out to multiple cores, the 10-core CPU is actually faster than the Ryzen 7 4750GE that we saw in the M95q Gen 2, which is sitting over here. But on the other hand, if you do get a workload that is highly stressing the CPUs, it turns out that the 10 cores really is not that much better, if better at all, than the Ryzen chip. Overall, the performance of this is a little bit faster than the Ryzen chip, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's something that if this was $200 or more, I would consider that worth it. If it was a couple dollars more, maybe, but realistically, they're pretty darn close. In terms of power consumption and noise, we'll flash the numbers up here, but realistically, we didn't get to anything that was too high. This was actually pretty much in line with what we saw with other systems. We do, however, get a 135 watt Lenovo power brick. And the reason that we get that higher power brick is really to pass through power to the USB ports. So that way, if you have a bigger power brick, you can drive more power to the USB ports. It's not necessarily just to go power the CPU. This is definitely a little bit higher power than some of the other units that we've tested, but at the same time, it has a 10-core CPU, so I guess that makes sense. And another way to look at it is that it's somewhere roughly about 2x as fast as my personal favorite Tiny Mini microprocessor right now on the value side, which is the Core i5-8500T. So this is definitely the case where you're using a little bit more power, but on the other hand, you're getting more performance. So I think that in terms of your overall efficiency, it's actually going up by getting a bigger system like this. That's an advantage of having those 10 cores. And if you compare it to like the older Core i5-6500T or something like that, where you only had like a 4-core, 4-thread processor, or the 6-core, 6-thread processors, the fact that you get the 10 cores and 20 threads on this, I think is actually really good. All right, so let's talk about pricing. And I'm going to just flash this up again, which is really the pricing that I paid for this particular unit. California has relatively high sales tax for the US. So depending on where you are, it could be more. Some places like Oregon don't have sales tax, so it's going to be significantly less than what I paid. But one thing that I will just say is that based on the price, you're going to see that there's a huge coupon discount. It's not necessarily, like a 50% discount, but it's also not that far off from 50%. A key thing to remember whenever you shop for these, especially if you're going to do configure to order option on Lenovo.com, definitely check for coupons, because honestly, the US Lenovo thing, they run coupons like every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that. And so if you see this unit and it's a lot more expensive today, look for coupons, wait a week or two, and you'll probably get a way better deal on it. Other little bits I want to note is there's also in this configuration, I did get Windows 10 Pro. I always suggest getting Windows 10 Pro because I just like to have Windows Desktop, but also to join domains. I just like that. It's easy on Windows 10 Pro, so that's why I do it. And the other thing is that you do get a 1-year on-site warranty, so if something goes wrong, then Lenovo will fix it. Now, of course, if you do, like, say, upgrade the RAM or you upgrade the NVMe SSD, and then you have an issue with your RAM, well, Lenovo's not going to cover the part that you put in there. I mean, of course, but at the same time, if there is a problem with like the CPU, motherboard, something like that, you do have an option. And that really brings me to the key lesson learned around this whole pricing thing, which is what about is it worth it to get the new unit? And I think that that's an interesting case. I think that a lot of the Core i5, like 8500T units nowadays that are maybe in the $350 range, they actually come with more memory than I got here. They may come with a better SSD, and maybe they're about half as fast. So you need 2 of them to equal about 1 of these. The original purpose of Project Tiny Mini Micro was to get these little x86 nodes that you could use to go build a cluster and put something like Ubuntu or just whatever you would normally put on a little cluster and go build out a whole bunch of these little units, but keep it in a very small footprint. That was like really the genesis idea of this whole series. So by the time you would go and add extra memory to this, maybe add a bigger SSD, you're probably talking about, getting over $1,000 per node, in which case you're starting to talk about 3 used Core i5-8500T nodes. And so just personally, if I wanted to have more nodes because I wanted to manage a cluster with multiple nodes, I actually think that the older units might be a little bit better of value. On the other hand, if I was super space constrained, which is a big reason that you'd look for a 1-liter node anyway, and also if I wanted to lower my overall power consumption, I do think that going to a bigger node like this makes a lot of sense. Quick other one, in compared to the M80q, we're going to get into the M80q when we do that formal review, but there are a lot of things that are depopulated, such as the extra slot, expansion slot that is in here. You don't have the second M.2 slot and stuff like that. And so I do really like if I were going to go buy a new unit, I do recommend that you go to the M90q over the M80q. You do save a couple dollars with the M80q, but in the end of the day, I just frankly think that the extra expansion in a small system is much better. So that's what I would do. And I still haven't figured out if I like the couple bucks that I spent for this dust filter or not. It seems like a little flimsy part. It wasn't super expensive. It's not super big. So I guess maybe it's worth it. But on the other hand, I don't think you're really missing that much if you don't have it. Overall, I do really like this unit. It has a lot to offer. It's definitely a big generational leap over what we saw 2 generations prior. We're not getting those like 10, 15% leaps anymore. I mean, this is more than 2x as fast as the Core i5s that we're using 2 generations older. So I definitely see the value in what Intel's doing and what AMD is pushing Intel to do in the space. At the same time, given the fact that the 11th gen core processors are starting to come into the market, I think we're going to see a refresh of the systems fairly soon, in which case these may go on sale. And if you don't need necessarily the new graphics engine in the 11th gen chips, then I think that there's a really strong reason that you might look at something like this. On the other hand, with the 11th gen rollout at Intel, I think that these systems are going to start seeing a little bit of discounting. And so, if you're buying them for your business, you probably already have corporate discounts. You may get a little bit better deal at the end of the month or something like that. But at the end of the day, if you're just buying a onesie twosie type of thing on the Lenovo.com website, I would expect that the couponing would get a little bit more aggressive as Lenovo tries to move this inventory, replacing it with the 11th gen inventory. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this look at the Lenovo ThinkCentre M90q Tiny. As you can tell, we took a little bit of a hiatus on Project Tiny Mini Micro between doing the NUCs and also the Xeon and Epic launches, but we're going to get back into hopefully doing these about weekly or so Project Tiny Mini Micro reviews. So of course, if you haven't already, why don't you give this video a like, click subscribe, turn on notifications so you don't miss any of those new videos. As always, thanks for watching and have an awesome day.